We are very, very pleased to have with us as our second speaker this evening, Dr. Robin Valeri. She comes to us from St. Bonaventure University, where she serves as a professor of psychology. She did her undergraduate work at Cornell and her master's and doctoral studies at Syracuse. It is not an exaggeration to say that Dr. Valeri is perhaps one of the most prolific authors on the subject of hate crimes. She has more than a dozen books and scholarly articles on the subject. Just in the last year, you've had at least 2 books published. One regarding skinhead history, identity, and culture, and the second called Hate Crimes, Typologies, Motivations, and Victims. She is here tonight to address a particular aspect of hate crimes, which is cyber hate, with a focus on anti-Semitism. It is our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Robin Valeri.
Thank you. So thank you all for having me tonight, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit. The focus of my talk is really on cyber hate, the impact the internet can have on people in terms of moving them to more extremist views. But I've been studying hate groups for close to about 15 years now. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of the background. So we're going to look at hate groups just a little bit, then cyber hate and really why cyberspace, the internet, has such a big impact, and then looking specifically at some of the anti-Semitism that is in cyberspace. So I know earlier today they had someone from the Southern Poverty Law Center here, and you might be familiar with their definition of a hate group, and I think it's a fairly standard one. It's a good one to go with, that all hate groups have beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically for their mutable characteristics. Jack Levin, who has studied hate groups and hate crimes for a lot longer than I have, talks about hate crimes, and he talks about thrill hate crimes, defensive hate crimes, and then the kind of mission hate crimes. And one thing that was brought up is that oftentimes the perpetrator does not know the victim, that they are just targeting the victim because of their race, of their gender, of their sexual preference, and they don't know them. And with the thrill hate crimes, it tends to be young adults or adolescents, teenagers who are bored and who, quite frankly, are looking to go out and have some fun. Oftentimes it's a group and the leader wants to show that it's most often a he, that he's strong, that he's tough, and they'll just pick a target because you're someone that is different from them. The defensive hate crime, they're more likely to know their target, and it's more you've moved into our neighborhood or into our place of work, and we don't want you in kind of the group you or your kind here, and so it's kind of sending that message. And then the mission one is more, it is their religion. So for a lot of white supremacists, it used to be Christian identity, that this is our mission, kind of from God, that we are trying to eliminate you. So just kind of, and so hate groups, and the other reason I bring up hate groups as well is because hate groups are behind a lot of the web pages that you see. Was that me beeping?
You're good.
Okay. Is that a warning? And this is just, Southern Poverty Law Center has a map of hate groups, and this is their most recent 2018 one. So you can see kind of just how many there are. And again, if you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, they have a lot of information on hate groups. So I just wanted to show that to you, to just show how prevalent they are. And then in 2018, there were 36 hate groups were tracked in Pennsylvania. There are 12 statewide ones that aren't showed here, but to just give you some sense of where hate groups are located. And again, if you wanted to see the list, I didn't want to fill the presentation with showing you. If you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, you can find them. So one of the things, although I'm focused on hate in cyberspace, is one of the things I want to talk about is that hate groups are very resourceful. And so traditionally they have been associated with recruiting in person and also kind of flyers, leaflets, and they still use those today. And so I don't want you to forget that, right? And so it can be through family and friends. In fact, my colleague who I do a lot of research with and friend, Kevin Borgeson, he had interviewed some neo-Nazi skinhead women, and he talked to one woman and he was asking her, what made you become a neo-Nazi skinhead? And she talks about the fact that she went to, so he's in the Boston area and it was someone in the Boston area. She had gone to a concert, so a music concert, and she had seen these women and she thought they looked really cool, and she thought, I want to be, she had been goth. She thought, I want to be like them. And so she went and talked to them and started hanging out with them, became friends with them, and essentially adopted their views so that she could become friends with them. So one is it can be through friends and family. And in fact, Kathleen Blee talks a little bit in her books about how oftentimes women are recruited into the movement because if you get the wife or the girlfriend, it makes it more likely that the guy is going to stay. So one, and then the other part is music can be a big draw to get people in, that people will listen to the music, start to adopt those beliefs, and join a hate group, or a lot of times they have concerts as well, and they go to those concerts. And one of them, the Hammerskins, is worldwide, and it's a skinhead group, but they're white supremacists, and they have these meet and greets. So before you go to their concert, they say, you need to come to one of our meetings so we can meet you and kind of vet you, and then you can go to the concert. And they kind of warn you ahead of time, you shouldn't just show up at our concert. But to me, especially as a social psychologist, the fact that you have to show up to one of their meetings, right, and do this meet and greet, it's going to make you then more committed to that group, because you have to go there and basically say to other people, this is what I believe, and then you're going to go to the concert. So it kind of solidifies your beliefs in that ideology. Right. And then this was in Bradford. So St. Bonaventure is right over the Pennsylvania border. And so Bradford is kind of right over the border from us. And it has been known to be kind of a big white supremacist area. And so this was advertised in the Bradford Era, which is their newspaper. The Bradford Era reported that the National Socialist Movement had hosted a meeting in Potter County, Pennsylvania on August 13th, 2016, and planned to hold another meeting on October 8th, 2016 in Ulysses, Pennsylvania for all white patriots. And they were saying that they were going to become kind of a stronghold for white patriots in that area. So they still use the traditional methods. And in fact, one of the things that they do is they'll leave leaflets, they'll leave flyers around, they'll leave them in bags in people's driveways, and to keep the bags with the flyers from blowing away, they'll put candy in the bag, right? And so these are just a couple of the flyers that the Klan had distributed at different times. On Martin Luther King Day Jr. in 2017 in Santa Ana, and I've tried to show you some of the range, so kind of all over the country, but so racial purity is America's security. This was in Maine. You can sleep tonight knowing the Klan is awake. And with these two, they leave some kind of, here's how to get in touch with us. And then Valentine's Day in Michigan, love your own race and stop homosexuality and race mixing. Next one was actually at a university in Michigan. And I show this for a number of reasons. One, so they're using, handouts, but also the anti-Semitism, but also the fact that in the last couple of years, they have been really targeting colleges and universities around the country with flyers, with posters. At one point, printers, they hacked into printers around universities, and so when you would go to print something, it would print out white supremacist literature or anti-Semitic literature, And so they have really been targeting universities around the country. Right. And I'm showing this quote and another one to just show that since the internet started, white supremacists or hate groups in general, any really extremist group, has really embraced the internet, and especially today. And in fact, today is the 30th birthday of the internet. It was invented 30 years ago. And if you think about it, one of the reasons that the internet has such an impact is worldwide, approximately 50% of the population, especially, a lot of it is because of cell phones, people can now access the internet. And in North America, that's closer to 95%. So it has really been a boon to hate groups because they can reach so many people and they can do it so cheaply. If you have a page on the web, it doesn't take a lot of money to maintain it. So this one was back in 2000, but since the beginning of the modern American white racialist movement, racists have used a variety of communication tools. And I want to point that out because they still use everything that's available to them, all the tools in their toolbox. They haven't given up on any of them, but you can see back in 2000, however, it is the internet that provides the most opportunities today, right? And that's still true, it hasn't changed. So 12 years later, basically, I want to show you it's the exact same quote. It's now expanded to not just include hate groups, but terrorist groups. Certainly, ISIS was one of the ones who really made use of the internet, of YouTube, of videos, published in their different online magazines in multiple languages. And so you see the same thing, right? Today, the internet, so we're up to 2012, but you could say the same thing now, plays an important role in many ways unique in radicalizing homegrown and domestic terrorists. And again, it's that they're using it as a platform to spread their ideas, right? One of their goals is to get their views into the mainstream. And we're going to talk about how they do that. So getting their views into the mainstream, getting it part of a political agenda. I won't point out any political people in particular, but getting it part of their language and their agenda, to connect with each other. And initially, that was one of their big things, is that they could use it to communicate with like-minded people, right? So we can talk amongst ourselves, and again, as a social psychologist, one of the things that I see is if we start talking, we're going to move to a more extreme position, because I want to show that I am just as devoted as you, if not more devoted, and so as a group, we're going to shift to a more extreme position. So to connect with each other, to make new recruits, to get people to go onto their web pages, read their information, start communicating with them, and become members of that group, to really start believing, and then, on the last part, to incite illegal and violent actions. And certainly we have seen that. Right? We saw it with Dylann Roof. We saw it at the Tree of Life Synagogue, that people get on the internet and they become followers and then they go out and act. And again, we saw that with a lot of ISIS followers as well. So this whole idea that we're going to get our views into the mainstream, we're going to recruit new members and get them to act. Right? And so as I mentioned, the start of the web was really the start of this viral hate. Once the web started, the two kind of groups that went on the web right away, pornography and hate, right? They were right there on the web. They kind of realized right away just how valuable of a tool this was. And so it dates back to the early 1990s. Again, 1989 was the year that National Public Radio gave, so I'm going with them, that the web started, right? And I'm going to show you a picture of Stormfront, but Stormfront has been talked about a lot here tonight, and it's considered the first white supremacist group, the first hate group that went online. And they started initially with a bulletin board, which I'm old enough to remember, but probably a lot of you aren't. And then in 1995, Stormfront became the first white nationalist website. So they've been on there. At one point, they got kicked off, but they're back up there, right? And someone mentioned Dylann Roof being on Stormfront's webpage, And in fact, so the Southern Poverty Law Center lists him, but in summer 2014, the Southern Poverty Law Center dubbed Stormfront as the murder capital of the internet because nearly 100 bias-related homicides were attributed to registered members of his, Don Black's, website. So he's on there, and let me show you a picture of it. I just showed you kind of the top part of it. But he has all of these different kind of private forums. You can go and read them. You can't post unless you want to join. But they're anything from white supremacist ideology, anti-Semitism, to advice on homeschooling, how to, if you start dating someone, when do you tell them that you're a white supremacist? Like, when do you bring that up? Should that be on the first date or later on, right? But one of the big things to me that you'll see, and this is relatively new also, is the idea that they are the embattled minority. So when I first started studying this 15 or so years ago, mainly if you were looking on a white supremacist website, it was all hate, hate, hate. We hate these different groups, and here's why we hate them, and why you should hate them. But now a lot of the hate groups are framing it as, so they, whoever the hate group is, whatever the extremist group is, we are under attack, and we are just defending ourselves. So it's been a change, or the other one for white supremacists is that it's about white pride. If there can be black pride, and there can be Hispanic pride, and there can be gay pride, well then we should be able to have white pride. If there can be, again, with universities, if there are black student unions, gay student unions, they should be able to have a white student union. And in fact, at Towson, I'm blanking on his name, had started one for a while, or had tried to start one. But so it's also a different kind of slant. Now it's, is one of theirs, is that they now see themselves as being under the gun. So why cyberspace? So again, Don Black is the founder of Stormfront, and he says the access is anonymous and there's unlimited ability to communicate with others of a like mind. And the anonymous is important, right? Because when people feel that they're anonymous, they oftentimes do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. And as a psychologist, there's debate, is it because they lose their identity? So, this is who I am and what I believe, and I lose it. Or is it just a change and now I pick up the group's identity? Whichever one it is, and it's more likely that they adopt the identity of the group, is they just feel to act in the way that the group would act. And so if the group is prejudiced, if they do heinous things, they are going to adopt those things. So the fact that it's anonymous is really important because it kind of frees people of their inhibitions, and they feel like I can just say anything and say I'm going to do anything is one of them. And then for the hate groups, that they can communicate with others of a like mind, right? You can reach a broad audience, a worldwide audience, in fact. And this, again, I show, even though it's from 1999 from the Anti-Defamation League, it is still true today. That's why I wanted to show it. It hasn't changed. So, and they were talking at that time about the Aryan Nation Liberty Net. So why do they love the web? What is it? How does it benefit them? It draws young people to the hate movements with appealing propaganda. And in fact, Don Black's son used to, on Stormfront, he used to run a kids page. And he had drawings for them, he had contests for them to specifically recruit little kids. Oftentimes they still have downloadable music. But he ran that page. What's interesting, an interesting story about his son, though, is he had been this big white supremacist. He goes to school in Florida. So he goes off to college in Florida, and he doesn't tell anyone there that he's a white supremacist. He's kind of keeping that on the down low, even though he would still do his radio broadcast with his dad in the morning. He travels abroad, for the semester abroad, and someone outs him. They find out who he is and that he's a white supremacist. So when he goes back to campus, everyone is shunning him, and it's actually a fellow student who's Jewish who starts to invite him to their Friday night dinner. And all of his friends are going, what are you doing inviting this guy to dinner? But he gets him eventually to start talking, to open up, and it's that friendship which then causes him to denounce the white supremacist movement and to leave that behind. So it was kind of making that friend and realizing, hey, these people aren't bad, you know. And just a little bit, gets off track a little bit, but Christian identity, I had mentioned before, is oftentimes, or in the past, it's lost some of its hold, was kind of the major belief of a lot of white supremacists. And this is kind of disturbing. So the Christian identity believe in something that's called two-seed line identity. And they say, although I asked one of my girlfriends who's a minister, and she said that's not in the Bible, they say it's based on the Bible, but according to them, Eve had sex with both Adam and the devil. And the offspring with Adam are the whites, and the offspring with the devil are Jews. And anyone else, if you're not white and you're not Jewish, then when they say God made other creatures, you fall into that category. So that's one of their fundamental beliefs, is this kind of two-seed line identity. Help stir up hatred against the enemies of white supremacy. Obviously, they're still doing that today. A means to make money. This is even more true today through Bitcoin, that you can now find a way to make money, to get people to give you money, and to maybe skirt some of the legal kind of financial rules that would keep that from happening. In the past, it was more that they would just sell things, sell music, sell, like if you went to the Klans page, you could download, a KKK sticker or something, but a lot of it was music. The system offered the potential for circulating secret coded messages among extremists, and then bypasses embargoes that nations outside of the United States placed on hate literature. And you can see this, Kevin and I and one of my students had done a content analysis of all skinhead web pages, but one of the things we looked at is, do they have literature in other languages? And you see that on some of the kind of hate pages where they'll put it out in other languages. And as I mentioned, ISIS was one who did that when they published their magazines, Dabek and Ramaya. They would put it out in different languages. So there was an English language version, a French version. You could get it in different languages so other people could read it. But especially with things like, Mein Kampf, so in the US, you could put that up, and you could put it up in German, and then maybe someone in Germany could access it. So those things are all today. And then, so this to me is kind of the interface. So again, they're recruiting from college students, these people, so American Renaissance and Fight White Genocide, they both have websites, and they really targeted college students, and they would try and get college students to go online. They had these posters available and encouraged you to download them, to print them out, and then to hang them up on your college campuses. And they even gave you advice where to put them so people would see it, but it wouldn't be something that, say, that your campus security might walk by and not notice. Right? And this, too, is one of their new taglines. Anti-racist is a code word for anti-white. And it's one that you can see on the web, on Twitter, and other places. That's kind of a code word that you're a white supremacist. American Renaissance is, I don't have a picture of their homepage. I'm going to show you another one, though, is interesting in that it presents itself as a think tank. So if you go to, say, an Aryan Nation webpage, it's very clear this is a white supremacist group, this is who we are, and this is who we hate. If you go to American Renaissance's homepage, they present themselves as a think tank that is studying kind of the difficult questions that are troubling our society today, and one of them is kind of issues of race. So they make themselves sound academic, sound very knowledgeable, to give themselves credibility. And that's important because that's a way for people to read that information and to maybe start them down that path of becoming an extremist. So especially with the recent synagogue shooting, I wanted to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism, and it's something that Kevin and I have been doing research on for close to 15 years. And in fact, our first study looked at this. But it's also become more pronounced because people are concerned that as the Holocaust survivors are passing away, people who liberated those camps are passing away, and even people who were guards who worked at those camps are all dying, that it's going to make it harder to challenge the rise on the internet of Holocaust denial or Holocaust minimization, where they say, well, yes, Jews were in these camps, but they're exaggerating how many people died. It was a war, people died, and the numbers for Jews or people in the camps weren't any larger, or, it wasn't a bad place, they were able to work, they had food, there was recreation, and so they're actually using some of the actual Nazi propaganda to try and convince people that the Holocaust either didn't happen or that it wasn't that bad, that it's being exaggerated. And they say that Jews are the ones who are driving the exaggeration so that they get more pity and people will support them. Right. So in 2018, the Anti-Semitism, the Anti-Defamation League put out a report, and in 2017 there was a 57% increase from the previous year. And also, there was an anti-Semitic incident in every state, which hadn't happened since at least 2010. Okay. They also looked at specifically kind of online hate. And so they analyzed over 7 million tweets and interviews with prominent Jewish Americans. And one of the things is that hate groups have really been targeting Jewish reporters. And in fact, a friend of mine who is Jewish and writes for Vox News, when he was getting married just recently, so I got married, old school, you send invitations in the mail. Now there's like different wedding company websites where you post that information and what you want for gifts. And his website was hacked because they didn't like what he'd written on Vox News, and they put up all of these anti-Semitic comments, and they made threats to him, and actually, they had to make sure where they were getting married was safe, etc. Right? And so there's been a significant increase in anti-Semitism online, and part of that has been in terms of either the Holocaust denial or the Holocaust minimization. Right? And these are just a couple of examples. Obviously, the most recent one was the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Prior to the attack, Robert Bowers had posted anti-Semitic comments on Gab. But before that, he had been online, and you can see his progression of becoming more extreme, and then finally, he chooses to act. I do have to say, I struggle. I had taken his name out, and then I put it back in because people will ask me what his name is. A lot of times, people don't want their names up there because it can incite other people to try and beat them. So there's always a struggle, should we put their names out there or not? And that is one of the things. You see this a lot with school shootings, where they'll look up someone who was a school shooter, and they go online, they not only see what they did, but how many people they were able to kill, and then they try and beat that, or they turn them into heroes, etc. So this was probably the most recent one. And also, too, I think one of the things, and it came up with Dylan Roof, is having kind of this manifesto is, you want to make it clear, in case you die, like what group, why you were doing this. And again, ISIS was a group that always encouraged their followers to do this, to go out, when you have your terrorist attack, and make sure you can somehow identify it, that you're doing this in the name of ISIS. And they used to try and get people to make videos beforehand. That led to some problems, and maybe them being found out. But then they were like, just have an ISIS flag in your vehicle or wherever you are so people know it's ISIS. And so you see that with Dylan Roof. You see it, he goes online beforehand, Bowers, and he says, I'm going in. So he makes that declaration and the why, so people know what he's doing, why he's doing it. And it gives them, again, I have to say, there's probably some that they're going for, they want that fame. Right? This was one, Kurt Eichenwald is a reporter, he's a journalist, and he has epilepsy. And so John Ravello actually sends him a tweet that's embedded with a strobe, thinking that the strobe is going to cause him to have a seizure. And after he does that, he then goes online and he tells his friends, I hope that, sending him the strobe, that he has a seizure and it killed him. And he actually does have a seizure and he ends up in the hospital for a while. I can't remember, I forget now what they ended up charging him with. Initially they were thinking possibly because it was premeditated, a higher level of the crime. And then Tanya Gersh is not a reporter, but this is one you might be familiar with. The Southern Poverty Law Center is representing her. So she was a real estate agent, and she was involved in trying to sell real estate for the mother of someone who was a white supremacist. And Andrew Anglin targets her. And so he's with the Daily Stormer, and that's gotten a lot of press, and he has kind of his troll army. So go on the web, send her a lot of anti-Semitic tweets, a lot of anti-Semitic email, however you can get to her, do that. And she has a husband and a son, and the son at the time that this was happening, I can't remember, he was early teens, 10, 14, somewhere in there, but like they actually sent him a picture. They had gotten a picture of him, and they made it so it showed a Nazi tank rolling over him. And then another one that they sent him was something that said, there's a free Xbox in the oven. Different things. So Southern Poverty Law Center is representing her, but Andrew Anglin has targeted other Jewish journalists, as well as others, people who are Muslim. He went after someone, I don't know if the reporter was Jewish or not, but someone who wrote something about, he's very pro-Trump, wrote something that was less than flattering about Melania Trump, and he sent his troll stormers after her as well. But he even went after someone who was a Jewish woman in Parliament in England. So, and again, it just shows, right, the web, people are on there and they just, oh, okay, I can do that. And they're sending off, it's anonymous, I'm going to send off this hate email or this hate image, things that they probably, hopefully wouldn't do in person. Right? So when Kevin and I started studying hate groups online, we looked to see what was out there, and we kind of came up with this idea that there were 3 faces of hate. Right? That some of the hate groups would take a very in-your-face approach to their web pages. Again, as I said, they made it very clear. Aryan Nations was one of them. It was very clear. This is who we are. We're a hate group. This is what we believe. So it was very much in your face. It was very clear. On the other hand, soft cell, we said, is kind of ambiguous. It's not clearly a hate group, but they're not kind of American Renaissance trying to say we're a think tank. It's somewhere in between. And then we said the false information, where they are trying to sell themselves as some kind of research think tank, as an academic group, or something along those lines. And in fact, before we leave this, is one of the things that you see now with different internet service providers trying to push hate groups off, is that some of them are becoming savvier at how they present themselves, and so they're toning down their image to make it less obvious that they're a hate group, so that they can stay on the web, right? But the other thing too is to make it more appealing. As I said, they want to get into the mainstream, and so in Pennsylvania, an example of the group is Keystone United. They used to be the Keystone State Skinheads. And they thought that was too, mainstream wasn't going to listen to them, to what they had to say. So they renamed themselves Keystone United. They started having the Leif Erikson Festival. They started presenting themselves as family friendly. They held events at their public library. And again, the idea is, right, someone who doesn't know who they are might go, oh, Leif Erikson Day, I wonder what that's about. Well, I have nothing to do today. I'm going to show up and go. And then you can start talking to someone and maybe slowly moving them from mainstream to a little bit more extreme, until then they're leaving the Keystone United and going to a more extremist group. Right? So initially, our first study 15 years ago was really, really simple. We found a web page called JewWatch, and it's still in existence. And we said, this one's kind of ambiguous. It's not, when you first look at it, obvious this is a hate web page. On the other hand, they're not really lying to you and saying, hey, we're a think tank. And this is what their web page looked like. And so we said this was kind of soft sell. And this first study we did was really simple. We kept the web page, and the only thing we did was we changed the name to either Jews are going to take over the world, so kind of the in-your-face, or Newswatch, which was the false information. And really what we wanted to see was, could students with these different names recognize how intolerant the group was? Right? That's what we want to know, especially Kevin and I both teach college, and you see some references on papers, and do you really know what this group is? And sometimes students are citing them and thinking it's a legitimate source, when in fact it's not. So I have to admit that that was in part what was driving it. So we show them, right, so this is the actual web page, and then the only thing we did was change the name to this was going to be our in-your-face, Jews are taking over the world, versus the false information, the Newswatch. And we have students rate them on a number of topics, but really what we wanted to see is the big one. We had a couple questions that, how intolerant is this website? And so students rated the Jews are taking over the world as significantly more intolerant than either JewWatch or Newswatch, but they didn't see those two, like the students who saw the JewWatch didn't rate that as any more intolerant than the people who saw the Newswatch, right? So it's kind of, if the name is a little bit more banal, if it's harder to identify that, hey, this is a hate website, some students are not going to realize it, right? So again, this study was about 15 years ago. And then more recently, this past year or two, we did a follow-up study, and in fact, it was driven by the fact that there was an increase in anti-Semitism online, a lot of the Holocaust denial. And in this one, we really wanted to go for external validity. So we found web pages that we thought, okay, this one looks professional, and it's got accurate information. This one looks professional, but it's inaccurate information. This is accurate information and not professional, and then inaccurate information. And you can see, I said JewWatch is still up there. So we looked at, we presented students, if you were a participant in our study, you're going to see all of these web pages. We presented you with pictures of their homepage and then pictures of their About Us section. I'm not going to show you all of them, but just for you to get a feel. So the Jewish Virtual Libraries are one that looks professional and has accurate information. And so this is their homepage. If you click on it, it looks like this. And then if you go to their About Us section, they say who they are and what they're doing. So this is actually accurate information and professional looking, right? On the other hand, the NISCOR project has accurate information, and it tends to focus actually on, as you can see, I'm dedicated to 12 million Holocaust victims who suffered and died at the hands of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime, that has accurate information, but it's not looking as professional. So one of the things we're trying to get at is, how much does really looks matter? This is one that has inaccurate information. The Southern Poverty Law Center actually identifies it as a Holocaust denial website, but it looks very professional, right? So can students tell, hey, this is an anti-Semitic webpage? And then JewWatch has updated its image a little bit, right? But so it's inaccurate information and unprofessional. So again, we asked students a number of questions, but part of it is to how intolerant is this website? And I'm going to show you the results, right? So in the left-hand column is all information about Jewish Virtual Library, the NISCOR, Institute for Historical Review. Oh, I forget I have this little handy-dandy thing. Oh, look at that, right? So the Jewish Virtual, so I'll walk you through it, but to me, right, Jewish Virtual Library looks very professional, and it has accurate information. And so this top line, these were on a scale of 1 to 7. The bottom line also scale of 1 to 7, and then the two in the middle were a 1 to 5 scale, all right? So a couple things. One of the things that I found really frightening is if you think about it, so 1 to 7 scale is all of the ratings, the average ratings are above the midpoint. So in terms of how factual is the information, even when they were on Jew Watch, it was above the midpoint of not at all factual to very factual. It was falling above the midpoint, leaning towards the factual side. In terms of credible, again, it's on a 5-point scale. So it's falling on the positive side. So not very credible to very credible. I found frightening. The only one that they didn't, as they seemed to get, was the tolerant, fell below the midpoint. But in terms of even asking how anti-Semitic, very anti-Semitic to very pro-Jewish, they still had it. This was a 7-point scale falling on the positive side of that, right? But one of the things, so that to me I found a little frightening, was if you look at the Jewish Virtual Library, students recognize it's a professional-looking web page, it's got accurate information, and they are good at identifying it as factual, credible, tolerant, and pro-Jewish. For the Jewish Virtual Library, and these numbers were significantly different if you're a student, but the Jewish Virtual Library, it's got inaccurate information, it's unprofessional, and by and large, they can at least say, oh, no, it's not very factual, it's not very credible, it's not very tolerant, it's not very pro-Jewish, right? The thing that really worried me, though, is really when you look at these two web pages, so NISCOR, it's got accurate information, but it's not very professional, versus Institute for Historical Review, it looks really good, looks very professional, right? And they cannot distinguish between these two, right? So they see NISCOR project as being as factual as Institute for Historical Review, as credible, as tolerant. The only place that doesn't work out, thankfully, is in how pro-Jewish. They are able to figure that out, right? But the other thing in terms of how, so looks matter here, but also if you look at between these, right? So again, NISCOR has factual information, but because it doesn't look good, they see it as being significantly less factual than the Jewish Virtual Library, is significantly less credible than the Jewish Virtual Library, and is significantly less tolerant than the Jewish Virtual Library, right? On the other hand, because the Institute for Historical Review looks good, they see that as being significantly more factual than Jew Watch, as significantly more credible, as significantly more tolerant. And so what concerns Kevin and I is that students would walk away, or just people in general, I mean, we use our students as guinea pigs for these things, but that people in general, if you stumbled across the Institute for Historical Review, right, you might walk away going, well, some of the stuff I think is a little sketchy, but some of it I think is true, right? That they can start you down the line of persuading you to believe their point of view, right? And it's just, again, as a social psychologist, it's just one step at a time. They're not asking you to go from way over here to way over here. We're just going to get you to work one step at a time down that path until we get you into the extremist camp, right? So looks do matter, and that's one of the powers of the web, is that it's gotten a lot easier to put up a web page, and it's gotten a lot easier to make it look good. And so if you can make yourself look professional, you can fool a lot of people into believing what you're selling, right? And obviously it's not just the web. You see that with a lot of scams on the web in terms of it's not just hate groups, right? You doing okay? So while I say all this, my students always then ask me, well, should we ban hate groups or should we ban hate speech? Oh, actually, we'll talk about why we hate more importantly. We'll get back to the other if we have time. Right? So interestingly, part of it is that there's a benefit to hating. So if you think about it, if someone does something to you, if I'm walking along and someone pushes me, I can just think, oh, it's an accident, or I can think, oh, they shoved me on purpose. And maybe that makes me angry. But anger is something that's spontaneous and it fades away. On the other hand, hate is something that you choose, right? You start mulling over that incident. Oh, so-and-so pushed me. right? If I think that they did it on purpose, and I start mulling it over and thinking about what a bad person they are and how nasty they are, and then I let that hatred, I foster that hatred. I kind of fertilize it, I let it grow, and I hang on to it. And the reason people hang on to their hatred is because it makes them feel superior. Oftentimes it makes them feel morally superior. I am better than that person. So one of the big things is when it comes to hatred, it's a choice. People choose to hate, and oftentimes it makes them feel better about themselves because now I'm superior to someone, either to an individual or in kind of the hate group world, to an entire group or groups of people. Right? And that gets into then the whole intergroup hatred. At the core of intergroup hatred comes your identity. So as long as there's two groups, there's room for hatred to grow. So initially, if you're part of a group, so part of your, forget about the mic. So part of your identity comes from the groups that you're involved in. So, I tell everyone I'm a volunteer firefighter. I'm very proud of that, right? So I get some of my identity through that. Or other things. So we get part of our identity through our groups, and we like to feel good about ourselves, and therefore we're going to naturally feel good about our groups. So at the start, you're going to feel good about your groups, or the group that you belong to. Now, right, if there's any kind of competition, any kind of conflict for a scarce resource, right, how can I justify giving more to my group, or all to my group than this other group? Well, it's because we're better. Right? And so conflict then can inspire you not just to like your group, but to start to belittle the other group, because then that justifies you keeping more or all of those resources. And in fact, that conflict, right, it doesn't have to be over a scarce resource. It can just be jealousy, right? That even if your group is better off than another group, that if you see that other group getting something, right, suddenly you're jealous. Even if they're not as good as you now, say if it's economically or socially or whatever it is, hey, wait, they got something that I didn't. I mean, it's to me, it's that kind of little kid mentality. I had two older sisters, I'd see them getting something, and I'd be like, well, where's mine, right? Except that this is at a group level. But it also comes from the fact that a lot of times groups are porous. And so if you're up here and you see someone else moving closer to you, then suddenly you feel threatened because it's like, oh my God, if they're getting closer to my group, one, they could end up equal to us, but maybe two, if groups are porous, I could fall down and be in that other group. So the intergroup hatred can stem from partly your identity, part from actually realistic conflict, but also more from just jealousy, kind of what's referred to as relative deprivation. You're feeling deprived because this other group got something that you didn't get, even if they're still worse off than you. And this isn't a comprehensive list of why, but one of them that's, to me, kind of intriguing is the idea of a revenge norm between groups, right? The idea, right, that you're going to get back at this other group. And with the revenge norm, right, so it can start out at the individual level. So someone attacks me, right, and my group goes, oh my gosh, Robin was attacked by this person, but it's not by this person, it's by this group. And suddenly you have these two groups now at war. So it's payback time, we're going to get revenge. But what happens, or the thing that's kind of frightening about revenge, is that it can occur over generations, right? So someone can then, my grandchild can go, oh my gosh, I just heard this story about grandma and how she was attacked by this group. Let's go back and get them. That other group. And maybe the person in that other group who attacked me is no longer there. So the revenge norm can occur across generations. It's just this idea that this group was attacked by this group, and now it's payback time, and it doesn't matter if that happened yesterday, a year ago, 10 years ago, we're going to go get revenge. So finally, this is what my students always ask me. And I have to admit here, I have served on the Cuba's Library Board of Trustees, and so I'm all about free speech. So should hate speech be banned? I tend to think no, but there is a line there, the things that you can't say. But in general, and I think this was an ADL person, free speech is vital to democracy. It's the lifeblood of democracy and an indispensable element of freedom. It's the guarantor of civil society. It protects the press, the academy, religion, political parties, and nonprofit associations. And it's certainly important in this day and age. But also, too, it's more just difficult for law enforcement to, and counter-terrorist organizations to monitor groups because, people put a lot of stuff online that you'd think, God, I can't believe you put that online. But they do, and so it makes it more difficult because now they're going to go to the dark web. But the other part, again, as a social psychologist, there's tons of resource. If you make something scarce, people want it more. And so now, if you make something scarce, you can't find that online, right? People are going to want to see it. What is it that I can't see? I want to go find it, right? And so that's going to then increase, and there's actually research showing it, their acceptance of it. If you make something scarce, they suddenly think, I want it, and it makes them also more accepting of it, even if it seems like something that they wouldn't normally believe, right? And then the last part of that is where they look at their behavior. If I worked so hard to find this, I must really believe this, right? And they do this, think about in your own world or your own life, if you ever gone online to buy I heard this show was in town, or for me up in Buffalo, I want to go see it, right? And you go to the web page. So I want to go see, I'm trying to think of a big, Hamilton. I want to go see Hamilton. It's going to be showing in Buffalo, right? I go to the Buffalo Theater page. I'm looking. They never tell you right up front, hey, click here. Here's how to buy the tickets and how much they are, right? You got to go through all these different web pages, right? If you spend all that time and effort finding it, when you finally go to buy it, you're like, well, I just invested all this time. I must really want to go. I'm going to buy those tickets even though they're this amount of money. So it's the same thing with finding hate information. If you invested all that time, you are going to think, I really must believe this. This is who I am. So in some sense, making it hard to get to could be working against what we're trying to accomplish. Right? And then, as I mentioned before, hate groups are getting more savvy. They don't want to have to keep finding a new name, a new place to, a new ISP for their web page. If they just kind of use the soft sell approach, it's going to be harder to identify. They can put their web page up there. And also, too, maybe then they can get people started who stumble across their web page to start believing it. Right? So how do we end hate? And this, I feel very kind of Pollyanna saying it. But both online and in person, to me, people want to belong. They want to have friends. They want, like most of us, we want to have friends. We want to be liked. And it starts with teaching people to be respectful and acting respectful of others. Right? I also think, and I don't have this as one of them, but also to assume the best in other people. I use the example, if I'm walking down the hall and someone bumps into me, I don't think that, I shouldn't leap to the fact that, they're trying to hurt me or they're trying to knock me down. I should assume that it's an accident. And again, research in psychology shows that a lot of people instead assume that they've been purposefully targeted. So how can we teach that? And research in developmental psych would suggest we teach people how to be empathetic from a very young age. From when you're raising little kids, you teach them empathy, to put themselves in the shoes of other people, right? And so that kind of comes to be kind, be empathetic. Imagine yourself in that person's shoes, right? And here, St. Bonaventure is really working on kind of decreasing any kind of bias, any kind of hate on campus. And so to me, it's reaching out to other people, right? So I'm teaching St. Bonaventure's diversity class, and one of the things that I had students do was kind of come up with their own identities. Here's 20 facets of your identity. And then I paired them with someone that they didn't know, and I said, your goal is to find 3 things, and it can't be we're both St. Bonaventure students, right? Or that we're both in this class, where you connect, where you share similar ideals or values or interests, right? And the whole purpose of that with the students is that you might meet someone and think, oh, we have nothing in common, or they're so different than I am. But if you spend the time, invest the time to get to know someone, I bet that you can find common areas of interest, things that you share. So get to know people, make friends with them, and then especially in terms of where you are, whether it's your dorm, where you work, in your neighborhood, if someone moves in, joins your place of work that's different from you, again, it gets into the group dynamics. If you reach out to them and make friends with them and you say, hey, this person is one of us. They are a fellow, they're a fellow St. Bonaventure employee. They're a fellow psychology professor. It doesn't matter what they look like or what they believe. If I then present them to the other people in my group as this is one of us, it's going to make them more accepting, right? This is someone who's part of us. Put them in your us group and get your friends then to include them in your us group. And then at a community level, just because hate groups and extremist groups have been so good at targeting people, if you're in a community group, whether it's education, religious, to do more to reach out. And the hard part is most of these groups are volunteered and you're already kind of maxed out in terms of what you can do, but to try and invite people in. If someone different comes along, include them, encourage them to join, make them feel a part of your community. And then lastly, some recommended reading. And Christian Piccolini's book, Romantic Violence, Memories of an American Skinhead, is a really interesting book in that he was a skinhead. He was a neo-Nazi skinhead. He joined a group when he was young. I think it was in Chicago. And it was through music that he joined. He actually had a white supremacist band. He moves to the head of the band. But then at some point, he realizes he's got to make money. And so because he's really into music, he thinks, I'm going to open a record store and I'm going to sell my white supremacist music behind the counter. But again, just like Don Black's son, it's those interpersonal connections. Because he realizes at that time he's got a wife and a kid, or maybe 2 kids. I got to make money here, right? He starts talking to people who come in, people who, as a white supremacist, I'm not talking to you, you're Jewish. I'm not talking to you, you're Hispanic, you're black, right? But because he's got to sell music, he starts talking to them, and they have that, and this is again why I talk about in the previous slide, is getting to know people and finding those commonalities. So he realizes in just talking to them about music that, hey, we like the same music, or some of the same music. And he starts to get to know them as people, as, not just music lovers, but he starts hearing about their family. And then he, again, gives up his white supremacist ideology and he starts some anti-hate groups. So his book I recommend. And then it's fiction, but Jodi Picoult's Small Great Things is a good book in that it really kind of talks about how someone can get into an extremist movement.